A secret war was being fought, not with bullets but with imagination. During World War II, Allied military strategists discovered an incredible weapon more powerful than tanks or planes: deception, and they were about to change the course of history using nothing more than rubber, canvas, and pure creativity. The story begins with a small team of designers, engineers, and artists who would become the masters of military illusion. Their mission: to convince Nazi Germany that the Allied invasion of Europe would happen somewhere completely different from their actual target. Operation Fortitude was their masterpiece, a complex web of fake armies, inflatable tanks, and elaborate radio transmissions designed to make the Germans believe the invasion would happen in Pas-de-Calais, France, not the actual landing site of Normandy. Colonel William Harris was one of the key architects of this remarkable plan. A British intelligence officer with an artist's imagination, Harris understood that warfare wasn't just about weapons, it was about controlling information, creating confusion, and making the enemy second-guess every decision. The team developed techniques that seemed almost absurd: inflatable tanks that looked real from a distance, wooden artillery pieces that could be moved to simulate troop movements, fake radio signals broadcasting fictional military communications. Their goal was to make the Germans believe an enormous invasion force was gathering in one location, when in reality, it was somewhere completely different. These weren't just props, they were precision-engineered deceptions. The inflatable tanks were carefully designed to cast shadows and create realistic silhouettes when viewed from reconnaissance planes. They used real tank tracks around them, created fake motor pool areas, and even positioned them to leave realistic imprints in the ground. Their most impressive trick: making nothing look like something. A field that appeared to be filled with hundreds of tanks and vehicles, but was actually just clever camouflage and a few carefully placed inflatables. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. Teams of actors and intelligence specialists would broadcast fake messages, create fictional unit communications, and maintain an entire phantom army through sound alone. They would discuss fictional troop movements, supply requirements, and battle preparations, all designed to convince German intelligence that a massive force was preparing to attack. By the time D-Day arrived, their work had paid off spectacularly. When the actual invasion of Normandy began, Hitler and his generals were convinced it was just a diversion. They kept massive tank and infantry divisions stationed near Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These artists of deception, because that's what they truly were, had created an entire fake world, a world so convincing that it really altered the strategy of World War II. By keeping significant German forces away from Normandy, these inflatable tanks and fake radio signals saved thousands of Allied lives. Their creativity was a weapon more precise than any bomb, more powerful than any tank. After the war, many of these designers returned to civilian life. Some went into advertising, others became artists, but for a brief, critical moment in history, they had been the invisible warriors who helped turn the tide of the greatest conflict humanity had ever seen. Subscribe for more stories like this. Their story wasn't just about military strategy. Take James Marcatel, one of the key designers in this deception unit. Before the war, he had been a set designer in Hollywood, creating elaborate movie backdrops that could trick audiences into believing entire fictional worlds. His skills translated perfectly to military deception. Marcatel understood something fundamental about perception. People see what they expect to see. If you could control expectations, you could control reality itself. His background in theater and visual design made him uniquely qualified to build these elaborate illusions. The technology they used was surprisingly advanced for the 1940s. Inflatable decoys weren't just simple balloons. They were sophisticated pneumatic structures that could be rapidly deployed and configured to mimic specific military equipment. Rubber and canvas tanks could be inflated in minutes, complete with realistic painted details that would fool even experienced reconnaissance pilots. Their radio deception was equally intricate. Teams would create entire fictional unit histories, complete with detailed personnel records, supply chains, and communication protocols. They would develop unique communication styles for each fabricated unit, ensuring that the messages felt authentic. One remarkable technique involved understanding German communication intercept methods. The Allied deception teams didn't just broadcast random noise, They carefully crafted messages that would be detected and interpreted exactly as they intended. They would leak just enough true information mixed with strategic misinformation to make their fictional narratives credible. The psychological warfare aspect was particularly fascinating. By creating doubt and uncertainty, they could paralyze enemy decision-making more effectively than any direct military action. Colonel William J. Darby, who worked closely with these deception units, later described their work as turning imagination into a tactical weapon. They weren't just soldiers or strategists, they were artists of misdirection, using creativity as their primary tool. Their methods went far beyond visual deception. They understood the complex ecosystem of military intelligence, how information traveled, how assumptions were formed, and how strategic decisions were made. Each fake tank, each fabricated radio transmission was part of an intricate narrative designed to mislead and confuse. The Germans had their own sophisticated intelligence apparatus, which made the Allied deception even more challenging. It wasn't enough to create a convincing illusion. That illusion had to withstand intense scrutiny from some of the most methodical military analysts in the world. Consider the planning that went into each deception. Teams would spend months building comprehensive backstories for fictional units. They would create fake supply requisitions, construct elaborate communication networks, and even plant physical evidence that would support their fabricated narratives. One particularly ingenious technique involved deliberately leaking information through controlled channels. They would ensure that certain pieces of misinformation would reach German intelligence through seemingly independent sources, creating a web of corroborating evidence that made their deceptions seem irrefutable. The psychological toll on the teams was significant. These weren't just military personnel executing a mission, they were artists and storytellers creating entire fictional worlds under immense pressure. One wrong detail could unravel months of careful preparation. They knew that perception is malleable, that reality is often more about interpretation than absolute truth. By controlling the narrative, they could really alter strategic decision-making. After the war, many of these specialists spoke about their experiences with a sense of wonder. A war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with imagination and narrative construction. Her own unit specialized in what they called narrative engineering, constructing elaborate fictional scenarios, so psychologically strong that enemy strategists would find them irresistibly believable. Take for instance their Operation Bodyguard, before the Normandy invasion. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was a massive intricate theatrical production where every detail was carefully choreographed. They created entire phantom armies, complete with radio chatter, dummy equipment, and fabricated personnel files. General Patton, with his larger-than-life persona, became a crucial actor in this grand deception, positioned as a threat to locations that were entirely fictional. The technological innovations supporting these psychological operations were equally remarkable. Specialized units developed techniques for creating false radio transmissions that mimicked authentic communication patterns. They studied German communication protocols, understanding not just the technical aspects of transmission, but the subtle linguistic nuances that would make their fabrications feel genuine. Sound engineering teams would record and manipulate radio communications, introducing deliberate imperfections that made the transmissions feel authentic. They understood that perfect transmissions could seem suspiciously clean, so they would introduce static, occasional speech hesitations, and communication artifacts that made their fictional scenarios feel lived in and real. Physical deception was an art form unto itself. Inflatable tanks that could be quickly deployed and repositioned, creating the illusion of massive troop movements. Dummy airfields constructed with such precision that aerial reconnaissance would register them as genuine military installations. These weren't just props, they were carefully designed optical illusions that could withstand sophisticated photographic analysis. Historians worked alongside psychologists, artists collaborated with military strategists, linguists partnered with sound engineers. They weren't just soldiers executing orders, they were architects of alternative realities. The Germans' own sophisticated intelligence apparatus made these deceptions even more challenging. German military analysts were renowned for their methodical approach, their ability to cross-reference information from multiple sources. This meant that Allied deception teams couldn't just create superficial narratives. They had to construct entire ecosystems of misinformation, that could withstand intense multilayered scrutiny. They understood that intelligence analysts, like all humans, have inherent psychological tendencies, confirmation bias, pattern recognition, pre-existing assumptions. By carefully studying these tendencies, they could design misinformation that would feel intuitively correct to their targets. The emotional and psychological landscape of war was their primary battlefield. Physical territories could be won or lost, but the terrain of perception was infinitely more complex and malleable. They were performing a kind of psychological judo, using the enemy's own analytical processes against themselves. Interestingly, many of these specialists came from academic and creative backgrounds. Novelists, theater designers, academic researchers, people trained in narrative construction and psychological manipulation found themselves at the forefront of this new form of warfare. Their professional skills, previously considered esoteric, became critical strategic assets. The technology of deception was evolving rapidly. Emerging communication technologies, rudimentary computer systems, and advanced photographic techniques provided new tools for crafting sophisticated illusions. But the core of their work remained really human mind understanding motivation, perception, and the delicate psychology of belief. The human element remained paramount in these intricate deception campaigns. Individual operatives understood that a single misplaced detail could unravel entire carefully constructed narratives. Major William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services OS, recognized early that psychological warfare represented a revolutionary approach to conflict. These were not traditional soldiers, but intellectual warriors who fought with information, perception, and strategic narrative. Their weapons were documents, radio transmissions, carefully planted rumors, carefully crafted scenarios that could redirect entire military campaigns. Operation Bodyguard, which successfully misled German forces about the D-Day invasion location, represented the pinnacle of these psychological manipulation techniques. Elaborate fake communication networks suggested the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, while the actual Normandy landings happened with strategic surprise. Many operatives never received public recognition. Their contributions remained classified for decades, their names unknown to history. Some died maintaining cover stories, others suffered psychological strain from living within constructed identities. After the war, many of these specialists transitioned into academic research, intelligence consulting, and communication strategy. Their wartime experiences really reshaped understanding of information warfare, psychological operations, and strategic communication. What had seemed like miraculous military successes were often the result of carefully planned psychological operations. Technological advances would eventually transform these techniques. Computer networks, digital communication, satellite intelligence all would build upon foundations laid by these World War II innovators. By war's end, these psychological warfare specialists had really altered military strategy. They proved that information could be as powerful as artillery, that narrative could redirect armies, that perception could determine conflict outcomes. Their legacy extended far beyond military applications. Modern marketing, political communication, crisis management, all bear the fingerprints of these pioneering psychological operatives. They demonstrated that human belief is malleable, that carefully constructed narratives could reshape reality itself. It wasn't about creating completely fictional scenarios, but about nudging existing perceptions in carefully advantageous directions. Survivors of these programs spoke rarely about their work. Many took their most intricate secrets to the grave, bound by professional and patriotic commitments. By 1947, most deception units had been formally disbanded. Some became professors, others worked in emerging intelligence agencies, a few transitioned into corporate communication roles. The full scope of their achievements would take decades to emerge, gradually revealed through scholarly research, declassified documents, and occasional memoirs. They had weaponized narrative itself, transforming information into a strategic asset more valuable than traditional military hardware. Subscribe if this story interested you and you want to hear more like it. The true magnitude of their psychological operations became clearer in subsequent conflicts. During the Cold War, these techniques evolved into more sophisticated intelligence strategies. CIA and KGB operatives used similar psychological manipulation tactics, learning from World War II predecessors. Declassified documents from the 1980s revealed intricate networks of information warfare that stretched across continents. These were not just military strategies, but complex human engineering projects designed to influence entire populations. The Vietnam War saw psychological operations reach new levels of complexity, with radio broadcasts, leaflet drops, and strategic communication becoming critical components of military engagement. By the 1990s, many of the original OSS psychological warfare specialists had passed away, but their intellectual legacy lived on. Academic institutions began developing entire research programs dedicated to understanding strategic communication and information warfare. Universities like Stanford, Harvard, and Georgetown created specialized courses examining these historical techniques. What emerged was a fascinating narrative of human manipulation at a grand scale. These were not simply soldiers or spies, but architects of perception who understood the deepest psychological mechanisms of human belief. They recognized that changing minds was often more effective than changing territory. Most spoke with a remarkable detachment, describing their work as a form of intellectual chess. They weren't motivated by personal glory, but by a genuine belief in strategic national defense. Their methods were precise, calculated, and very subtle. By the early 2000s, digital technology would transform these techniques even further. Social media, internet communication, and global information networks became the new battlegrounds of psychological influence. The principles developed by those World War II specialists remained really unchanged. Only the tools had evolved. The last living members of these original psychological warfare units died in relative obscurity. Most received minimal public recognition, their contributions known only to a small circle of military historians and intelligence professionals. In 2005, the National Archives released additional classified documents revealing the full scope of their wartime operations. Scholars and researchers discovered networks of influence more complex than anyone had previously imagined. These were not just military strategies, but sophisticated human engineering projects that reshaped global understanding. They transformed warfare from a purely physical confrontation into a complex psychological engagement. Modern communication, political strategy, and global diplomacy continue to bear their intellectual fingerprints. They were pioneers who understood that the most important battles are often fought, not with weapons but with ideas. Subscribe if this story interested you, and you want to hear more like it.